Okay, we're saying this at the beginning. You know what the deal is. Subscribe, like the video, comment, etc. These videos take ages and ages to make, so it shows me good reception when you actually do all that good stuff, and it helps other people see the video. That said, we're going a little bit lighter on the visual aids this time because Shueisha rolled up to my house and said, "Those are some nice, very expensive anime figures you got there. Would be a shame if something happened to them." So I'm going to heed their warning and go a little bit lighter on use of visuals this time. Hope y'all understand, that's YouTube for you. Okay, on with the show. The year is 1998. The world was introduced to Britney Spears, Google was founded, Bill Clinton is denying allegations, and if you're a weeb, and I know you are, Sailor Moon and Dragon Ball Z have begun their run on Toonami, and Cowboy Bebop and Outlaw Star have began running in Japan. As for Nintendo, between last time and now, two important things have occurred. 1. Pokemon has become a cultural juggernaut globally whose empire will certainly outlive its creators, and 2. In a move entirely unthinkable today, the follow-up, Pokemon Gold and Silver, which were slated to be released in 1998, had been delayed. So, what do you do when the people want more Pokemon, yet you have no more Pokemon to give? Well, internationally this wasn't a huge issue, because Viz Media and the at the time young 4Kids Entertainment, unlike Japan, would have content that they could deal out slowly piecemeal over the course of several years. 4Kids, Viz Media, and Nintendo of America had a wealth of Pokemon content that could be carefully curated and adapted at their own pace. This wouldn't necessarily be stopped by Ash and Company ending their adventures in Kanto, with more than enough content to keep up for 2 years for when Gold and Silver would actually be released in 2000. The solution for Japan that would lead to the huge burst of curated content was one of the boldest and most creative waves of content in Pokemon history. Not in terms of quality, because that could commonly be questionable, but in terms of getting creative with the material. We saw a temporary stop to the mostly pragmatic adaptations of Pokemon material, and would now see the weird stuff. From the creative liberty-fueled anime adaptations like Dengeki Pikachu, Ash and Company on the TV side of things venturing into the Orange Archipelago, and the cardinal sin of eschewing Pokemon battling altogether for adaptations like Hey You Pikachu and Pokemon Snap, and the very interesting, yet very much ignored, Pokemon Magical Journey, one of the few instances of Pokemon venturing into the shoujo genre. The crowning jewel, even if it's ironically one of the least interesting pieces from around this time, would be a re-release of Pokemon Red and Blue that has had their sprites and minor story details worked to be more in line with the anime, and most notably, adding Pikachu as a starting Pokemon, leading in today's manga, the Yellow Arc of Pokemon Adventure. So, what do you do with the video game that you've already adapted that you have a revised version of being based on an anime? The obvious answer would be maybe adapt the anime filler into your own content. Dengeki Pikachu would do something very similar. Everything about this story is lined up to be semi-inconsequential filler. I've even characterized it as filler before, although that is a clickbaity opinion that I definitely filled up from a well actually. The solution that the adventure duo of Hidenori Kusaka and Mato came up with is characteristic of what Pokemon Adventure is, flying off the rails of established game canon entirely in favor of a more interesting story that takes the smallest of tenuous connections and pretends like it was planned the entire time. Okay, and I forgot to say this at the beginning, so take a shot every time I say, "Hey You Pikachu." You aren't gonna get drunk, but you shockingly won't be sober. So last time we left off, Red has obliterated Team Rocket, stopped them from making the ultimate Pokemon, and defeated Blue, showing the whole world that kindness can defeat pure, unadulterated skill. Blue has left to reflect on his defeat and also train, while Green is off to parts unknown to do ulterior motive stuff that I'm sure won't be important soon. With the Elite Four from the video games that were conveniently left out of the last arc, looming overhead ominously as the pages close, as anime antagonists tend to do. We pick up now with Agatha of the Elite Four in the ruins of the Sylph Company, retrieving the badge amplifier, presumably in the semi-immediate aftermath of the battle at the Sylph Company headquarters. 2 years have passed since then, and Red is now a huge celebrity trainer worldwide. Or region-wide. We're not quite at the point to where we have other regions to deal with. Anyway, 2 years have passed, and Red is now a huge celebrity region-wide, and many trainers reach out to challenge him. He gets a right from Bruno of the Elite Four, and this seems to be some part of a greater plan, because after Red receives this invitation and goes off to challenge Bruno, he isn't heard from again. Professor Oak, as he just sort of does, isn't very concerned with Red vanishing. He's more concerned with Red finishing that Pokedex. I'd like to again highlight that Professor Oak is a pretty absent-minded one-track person. For example, the "what's my grandson's name" thing isn't a joke in-game. He just actually says that and seems to be a very forgetful and one-track person. One day we may talk about the different versions of Professor Oak, like sometimes in the anime he's a wacky professor who randomly likes to make fast food when he obviously has options far beyond that and recite poetry, while other times he sort of is a stuck-up, really snobbish professor that doesn't really care if you pass or fail, and all sorts of other different adaptations. But for here today, we have Professor Oak that is a little bit indifferent to the suffering around him until it's relatively extreme. And here is a perfect example of that, with Pika marching into the room and collapsing on the ground, shortly followed in after by a mysterious young man who says he's on a mission to find Red and he needs Pikachu's help. But before that, Professor Oak questions the young man, to which he gets no information, but as a test to see where this person's character is, Professor Oak challenges this person to a Pokemon battle, but is soundly defeated by the mysterious stranger's Doduo, without even so much as laying a finger on Professor Oak's Spearow. Pikachu seems to really like this person, so Professor Oak figures, if Pikachu likes you, then I guess you're probably okay, and you seem to know more about the situation than we do, so he hands over Red's Pokedex and lets Pikachu tag along with this new guy. Also, please note Pikachu is now less battered. That's going to be very important later. Misty and Professor Oak reach out to the other good gym leaders of Kanto to try to get a search party going, while the stranger and Pikachu set out and search for Red, which is primarily the thrust of this arc. In a Kanto that Red has largely left behind, and for the most part has left sort of do its own thing, healing from the scars of Team Rocket, where has he gone? Who are the Elite Four? What do they want with Red? And where does our mysterious stranger friend fit into the broader mystery? Well, there's not really too much point in trying to hide the identity of this person. This is our new protagonist, Yellow. They try to keep Yellow's name and gender a secret for the first third of the manga, but there's a very clear naming scheme of red, blue, and green, and Yellow was in the previous arc as a character that Red helped out towards the end. I'm actually not entirely sure why they tried to hide this from us as the reader. There is reason for this in canon, but you know what I mean. I don't think I'll be doing a character section for this video besides Yellow and the Elite Four, but a lot of Yellow is a character that doesn't care much for violence, and that's an interesting angle for the protagonist of a series that is mostly about violence. And even for a series mostly about violence, the part of the series that has the most fleshed out relationship with violence, let's put it like that. Because Pokemon Adventure Yellow tends to tell its narrative in relatively short time spans, so quirks like an anime fighting protagonist that really doesn't like to fight and has a very particular noble code of justice around violence, etc., and forcing that to its logical extreme that we'll do over this journey, is an interesting quirk that never overstates its welcome. Now, Viz took an interesting approach in not wanting to immediately spoil things by just calling the arc Pokemon Adventure Yellow. So, in the first printing, they took the liberty of naming the arc Pokemon Adventure Yellow Caballero. That means gentleman in Spanish, but it largely refers to cowboys, because Yellow rides upon a Pokemon, and has a somewhat Western-inspired outfit. Has a cool cowboy hat, a strict code of honor when it comes to violence, and Caballero kind of contains the word yellow depending on your regional accent. It doesn't when I say it, because I butcher it, but so the title implies. Yellow could be a title or an epithet, similar to how in One Piece Luffy is commonly referred to as Straw Hat. Yellow's visual design seems to be a semi-modernized take on Tezuka's classic and another likely target of analysis one day, Princess Knight, that has its own interesting relationship with gender roles that from a 20XX lens, we can probably do circles around now. But as far as I can tell, this inspiration is primarily a visual one without a whole lot of Princess Sapphire's influence, but I do appreciate the potential subtext of saying, while Princess Sapphire could not be a knight unless she pretends to be a man, Yellow cannot be the protagonist of a long-running shonen series unless if she also pretends to be a man. This probably wasn't intended, but hey, it could be a bit of meta commentary on the state of shonen series aimed at 9 to 10-year-olds. Yellow also has the honor of being the first original character of the manga. The manga will have a few of these over time, but Yellow seems to be the one that's the most plot critical for quite a while. We will get a character named Emerald in a few parts, but the bulk of the cast of Pokemon Adventures is made of retooled adaptations of protagonists and NPCs from the game. So it's kind of fitting that after this, in the next arc, Yellow tends to be broadly left by the wayside a little bit more than fans would like. And it would also be fitting that Yellow is one of the most beloved and overlooked characters, but we'll take a look at Yellow's absence once she starts being absent. I feel like this is getting long, so let's just keep going. Yellow and Pika venture into Viridian Forest that's still ecologically recovering from Team Rocket. But they also bump into Bill along the way, but before long they are chased down by Lauralee of the Elite Four. And a lot of anime fights happen, and I'm just going to have to use the term anime fights because I don't know if there's much point in me describing every punch and kick. However, a fight that very much reminds me of, oh, don't say it. Oh, don't say it. Oh no, I can't think of any other examples. A fight from JoJo, the pet shop fight. You know the one. Specifically in terms of how brutal and how savage Lauralee is as a chaser with ice-based powers. She's chasing them, and through some very quick thinking, managed to just narrowly get away without actually ever engaging with Lauralee. Something of note here that we will touch down a lot more later on is that Yellow isn't really much of a fighter. While she does have the unique strength of using Pokemon's abilities to the best of their, well, ability, for lack of better words, she just isn't really much of a fighter, and the Elite Four are broadly on a whole nother class of trainer. In fact, some of them come in and do big fuck-off Dragon Ball Z beams. But we'll circle back to the big Dragon Ball Z lasers when we get to it. Meanwhile, it's good to know that Lauralee, the Ice-type master of the Elite Four, enforces a very strict take-no-prisoners policy. While the Elite Four were battling Red, Pikachu managed to get away, but Lauralee takes it upon herself to hunt down and kill Pikachu. Something I didn't mention before that is only just now being plot relevant is that Yellow seems to have an incidental ability to be able to read the hearts and minds of Pokemon, and is also from Viridian Forest, and also has the ability to heal them as well. Lauralee reports this information back to Agatha, and while initially the plan was to kill Pikachu as a matter of principle, with Yellow potentially being able to read Pokemon's minds, albeit not especially well at this point, if this ability was allowed to proliferate, it would mean that leaving Pikachu, Yellow, and now Bill alive is just a huge liability, especially because Lauralee did the very intelligent move of blabbing who Bruno is to our gang. So, sorry Bill, I guess you were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Yellow and Pikachu end up washing up near Celadon City and getting help from Erica, who, because I can't find anywhere else to put this, is apparently a professor. Erica helps the duo and talks Pika out of not just looking for Red solo. Erica tries to take Pikachu into her own custody, but sighting of someone that looks like Red have been spotted, but it's not Red at all, it's super nerd Miles who knocks Erica out. Typical nerds, not respecting women. Miles mostly uses his Pokemon to beat Yellow to death, for the most part, but at the last moment is saved by Misty, Erica, Brock, and Blaine being contacted later, who by the way has a Rapidash phone, and I don't know if I like that or hate that. And a Caterpie almost gets caught in the crossfire, but is saved by Yellow, and the gang are saved from Super Nerd Miles getting away by Blue showing up at the last second, and here he is. Blue chews Yellow out for being a little too kind on letting Ghastly get away, and Missy takes umbrage with this, as it's never a bad thing to be kind to Pokemon. But what Blue was more so getting at is that Yellow is a very inexperienced trainer. To fight someone like the Elite Four, she has to be more on par with someone like Red, who they defeated. If Red was here, he would have found a way to stop the Super Nerd, save Erica, while also making sure that Pokemon was safe. And as long as there are people like the Elite Four and like Team Rocket out there, kindness is a privilege of those strong enough to enact it. And Yellow more or less knows and acknowledges this immediately. Had she been a more experienced trainer, she would have better used the tools at her disposal, like knowing her Pokemon's moves a little better, being able to effectively use her Pokedex, being able to effectively see through the Super Nerd's traps, being able to have Pokemon that are more effective at fighting, and all sorts of other stuff that actually does come up a lot more in this arc. So, meanwhile, she asks Blue to help her train to get stronger to fight the Elite Four. And for safekeeping, since most of her Pokemon actually aren't much of a fighter, since most of her Pokemon aren't huge on fighting, Brock and Misty give her a Graveler and Omastar respectively for safekeeping, because it's better to have 3 Pokemon that can fight than just one that actually doesn't belong to you. So Blue, Yellow, Pika, her new Pokemon, and her old Pokemon, I suppose, take off for the dusty heights of Route 24, and on the flight there, we get a flashback. So this is where things start to get a little interesting. So something Pokemon Adventures tends to be very good about is taking happened upon facts in the game and weaving them into a narrative that feels logical and had some level of foreshadowing. This is one of the more interesting examples of this. So in most forms of Pokemon media, Blue is the grandson of Professor Oak, and Professor Oak retired from training ages ago to work on the Pokedex, much to the disappointment of his longtime friend and rival, and depending on the adaptation, possibly more, Agatha, the Ghost-type specialist, who would eventually go on to become one of the Elite Four. And this is basically true here. Blue at some point visits the Pokemon Tower for various reasons that are unspecified in the game, but due to possible possession in the manga. So Blue has some type of connection and experience with Ghost, and the Ghost-type Master has some type of connection with Blue. In many ways, Agatha may see some type of connection between Blue and Professor Oak, not just being his grandson, but someone who may have more fire under his belt when it comes to being able to fight with Pokemon and training. Speaking of Ghost, early Pokemon manga seem to have a fascination with Ghost. I think this is the 5th time we've talked about the Ghastly line, and it's not even going to be the last, not even in this video. Hey, this isn't even going to be the last Pokemon adaptation where we spend a lot of time talking about Ghost Pokemon in the Pokemon Tower, so get this hot piece of lore. So Agatha hates the power plant as she feels it's a monument to human folly and arrogance. It was built and abandoned in a halfway created state, but by making it, it displaced a countless number of Pokemon and caused the pollution of the land around it, and a lot of Pokemon just died. And the Pokemons whose deaths were caused by pollution tend to gather here, and also gather at the Pokemon Tower due to its close proximity to the power plant as vengeful spirits. Specifically Ghastly, Haunter, and Gengar, who were just attracted to the toxins that the plant spews. This is why the only Ghost-type Pokemon native to Kanto are also part poison. Man, remember that technology gone too far thing I talked about last time? Well, here it is again. That's a theme I never really considered before starting this arc. Anyway, I bring this all up because the flashback we have connects Blue with the Elite Four, in that 2 years ago he was out training, he found a young trainer who's trying to capture a Lapras. Blue captured it instead, and it turns out the trainer was trying to use the Lapras to hunt down his lost Haunter that had gone to the Pokemon Tower, that had gone into the power plant. Unfortunately, Agatha is just sort of hanging out in the power plant and happens to just have a grudge with Professor Oak, and while she was just planning to mess with the kids and let them go, when she found out that Blue is the grandson of Professor Oak, she figures, you know, actually, let's just kill him. This is a great time to get some revenge. Leading to one of my favorite visual representations of hypnosis in Dream Leader, in Blue being stuck in a phantom transparent casket, which is just the coolest thing in the world. But thanks to some cool anime moments and the kid he was with really stepping up to the plate, they managed to fight Agatha off, although she does get away, bringing us back to the right now, where Yellow and Blue are in the middle of training. Most of this training takes place off-screen, but I'll give you some of the cliff notes. 1, apparently the Pokedex can just stop evolution, and Yellow apparently had no idea that Pokemon can evolve. I think they're trying to bake in the character flaw here, but it feels a little inorganic that Yellow doesn't like change. But it is interesting that they tie in the hitting the B button to stop evolution as a Pokedex function. Also, the Caterpie that Yellow saved before is here and has joined the team. Yellow, while still reluctant to fight, learns how to let her Pokemon cut loose, and while she doesn't quite get a hang of letting her Pokemon evolve now, she's getting there. She will in time. The same is true for catching Pokemon, where Yellow also seems to struggle quite a bit with this, feeling uncomfortable with the fact that you have to harm a Pokemon in order to catch it, because most of her Pokemon have more or less joined her party through consent. Her Doduo was a gift, and the same is true for her Rattata, and Caterpie just sort of decided it wanted to join, and Omastar and Graveler were both gifts. Also, while Blue is getting a lot of screen time here, I don't really have another place to put this organically, but hey, did you know that Blue's appearance, specifically with this cool cape, influenced Gary's appearance in the anime? Yeah, it's true. Gary's seen with this same cape in the Johto arc of the anime. Also, the idea of Blue cooling off may have inspired changes in Gary as well, where Blue becomes more of a reliable third wheel type or a senior trainer with strong judgment. The character of Gary learns respect for his opponent. So, I'm not sure if that link was intentional or just a natural place for both of those characters to go. Also, Yellow names her Caterpie Kitty. That's a very good nickname, and this is probably the only time I've ever felt a Caterpie, or, well, honestly, really all of Yellow's Pokemon except for Pikachu, would be cute. Sorry about that, Helix Chads. Yellow figures that she can't stay under Blue's wing forever, so she sets out to go training on her own, and also keep up the hunt for Red. Yellow resolves to go her separate ways from Blue after more training because she knows she can't stay under his wing forever, but promises to keep up the hunt for Red solo while still getting stronger. However, none of Yellow's Pokemon are especially strong swimmers, so she takes a retooled SSN that is once again under attack by Team Rocket out to Vermilion City, leading to the first of many comic book style retcons. So, you know how Poliwhirl last time was tossed off the boat and turned into a Poliwrath to save Red? Well, turns out this was because there was a legendary evolution stone at the bottom of the sea, one that can be reused that exists at the bottom of the harbor, and after dispatching Team Rocket, Yellow checks that out, and it seems that at some point Red may have been here and took them at some point. Meanwhile, Green is here doing her thing, doing cool spy stuff, breaking into Bill's house on the hunt for Red, and trying to use Bill's PC technology to hack in and find out where Red had last deposited or withdrew any Pokemon. Finding out that location should tell them roughly where Red was last spotted. This is a pretty clever way of using the Pokemon PC, and another way to get Bill, poor Cloudy is, involved with the plot since he's still a major target of the Elite Four. Which, speaking of, they are immediately attacked by Bruno's Hitmonlee before being able to confirm where Red last was. But they can confirm that he did withdraw a Pokemon recently, so he's still alive at least. Anyway, Green manages to defeat Bruno by leading it far enough away to where it can't really get any more orders from its master, but also her Blastoids can, because Green has the microphone from Hey You Pikachu giving instructions to her Blastoids. Meanwhile, Yellow is still on the hunt for a strong swimming Pokemon to help look for Red. She had her eye set on a Dragonair, but then the leader of the Elite Four himself, Lance, finally makes his debut. He takes the Dragonair and announces that he has an issue with all Pokemon trainers, and decides not to kill Pikachu today, but that may be because their plan is so close to completion that it no longer matters, and he takes off to his base across the sea on Ceres Island. But of course, before doing that, he decides to just vaporize half of Vermilion City with a big Dragon Ball Z hyper beam. So that's very kind of him. And again, much like Dragon Ball Z circa 1999, if you're watching the English dub, he first says, "Don't worry, no one died." And of course, in the panel immediately after, saying, "Okay, maybe a bunch of people died, but they might not have died." They give chase to Lance, and thankfully, after quite a bit of training, Pikachu has learned Surf. I guess that's your other Pokemon Yellow reference. He learned this off-screen, but as far as I can understand, this surfboard situation is more so just Pikachu using Substitute, but the Substitute happens to be shaped like a surfboard. And I suppose Substitutes are just water resistant, I suppose. So they surf across the sea to give chase, with their first stop along the way being Cinnabar Island, where they meet Blaine, who has been hiding out from the Elite Four while using his Generation 1 design that was not used in the actual game. Once again, in adventure style, I love that every part of the Miltank is being used. They are then contacted by Brock, who tells them that Red was spotted near Mount Moon, but the only remains of him seems to be some type of cocoon with the back ripped out. But at the same time, the Kanto cities with good gym leaders are being attacked by ghost-fighting dragon and ice-type Pokemon, so obviously the Elite Four are up to something and their plan is going down. So, Blaine and Yellow head out to Ceres Island. This is also known as Suo Island in Japanese. And there's a reason I mention that, while I mention it for no other place. And that is because Suo Island shares a name with the Suo Coast from Hey You Pikachu and Pokemon Channel. It seems to be a recurring location between Hey You Pikachu and Pokemon Channel, where in Hey You Pikachu, which would have been the only game that would be out that has this location, you smash a piñata at a party, and also do some treasure hunting. Not really sure why they elected to make not one, but two references to Hey You Pikachu, but I am here for it. Not to be confused with the Cobalt Coastlands of Pokemon Arceus. That's a different place, with a different name in Japanese. They then meet up with a reformed Rocket trio of Sabrina, Koga, and Surge, and decide to team up, as Team Rocket was planning on taking on the Elite Four themselves, and that SS Anne situation from a few chapters ago was actually them preparing for that. Who would have thought, as turns out, taking over the world is actually quite difficult when someone wants to extinguish all human life on it. But before the final battle with the Elite Four, we have a flashback to Bruno and Red's battle. Bruno seems to be a proud warrior guy who has a genuine passion for battling and genuinely loves Pokemon as well. And unlike the likes of Giovanni, Bruno actually likes Pokemon, and really the whole Elite Four thing isn't quite doing it for him, but I'm reading a little bit in between the lines here, but there seems to be a schism between Bruno and the rest of the Elite Four. But not too much though, he's still down with their general game plan. But and we'll discuss this much later, the other three members have a certain level of hate and bile in them, and genuinely just want to cause havoc on humanity and sort of claim revenge for Pokemon while also having some of their own semi-personal vendettas to hammer out as well. Bruno tends to feel that humanity can learn from Pokemon, and should do it, and understands that some people, like Red and like Yellow and like our heroes, broadly do know how to do that, and maybe the rest of humanity can also learn to do that as well. But maybe not in the time span that they would like, so I guess the plan to destroy Kanto is on. But in short, Lorelei and Agatha think that this is impossible and just mostly seems to be out for revenge on the behalf of Pokemon, and not just angry that there's little environmental justice for Pokemon despite being in a world that claims to love Pokemon, but we will return to this when we get to the themes. But for the time being, just understand that the Elite Four are broadly a group of eco-terrorists that plan to do something on Ceres Island to wipe out humanity, starting with Kanto. And again, this plan, like Team Rocket's, will involve having all 8 badges and the badge amplifier. And as turns out, the Elite Four dragged Red all the way out here to grill him on information about where Giovanni is because they need the Boulder Badge, and also to recruit him into the Elite Four. I wonder how having an Elite 5 would work, because while in English Elite 4 is a sort of arbitrary name that could have been Elite 5 or Elite 6 or Elite 10 and so on and so forth, it uses a very specific term in Japanese that I'll get to that later. But anyway, Red gets jumped by the rest of the Elite Four, leaving Pikachu as the only one who escaped, leading up to right now. So back on Ceres Island, Green and Bill show up to give Yellow and pals a hand, and Yellow and Green seem to know each other for reasons that we'll get into later. Green uses her expertise to try to sneak into the deeper layers of the island to meet up with Blaine and Blue and the Rocket Trio. The Rockets, while definitely sort of reformed last time we saw them, are still definitely evil, and mostly here to clear a way for Team Rocket to have a full resurgence later. Once again, it's a little hard to take over society if someone is hell-bent on destroying it. The team splits up, sort of arbitrarily based on destiny, as predicted with Sabrina's Alakazam. Yellow with Blaine, Koga with Blue, Sabrina with Green, and Surge with... well, we know it would have been Red if he were here, but he is just kind of paired with Bill because, well, there's no one else here, and I guess you're paired up with Teacher, and keep in mind, Bill is not much of a fighter, so this is also for comic relief. Poor Bill. Something pretty clever here that I like that we don't really see that much in Pokemon, but we do see a lot in other monster series like Digimon, is when you have big groups of people that all have their own party of monsters with them, to simply break them up into smaller groups, because it would be hard to really have an all-out brawl with 8 good guys and 4 bad guys all in one spot when most of these characters have about 6 different Pokemon with them. That comes out to be a lot of characters, so from a writing perspective, it makes sense to simply split the team up. Altogether, that's at least 24 characters to keep track of, and Pokemon Adventure chapters tend to be about 20 pages and come out monthly, so this is just a more economical way of telling a story, with having pairs of people try to take on each of the Elite Four. So Blue and Koga have sort of learned to crush their beef and have grown a sort of mutual respect for each other, as Koga is more of a punch clock villain, loyal to more of a promise and professionality than doing particular evil, and he's not necessarily a person who's evil to its core, and Blue seems to have some sense of this. It's probably helping that Blue has had Koga's Golbat in his party for the last 2 years, and its goofy appearance relative to Agatha's really gets us rooting for Blue and Koga. Actually, Koga and Agatha have a lot of Pokemon in common, so it sort of makes sense for these characters specifically to be paired up with each other. But this is probably one part using every part of the Miltank that we possibly can, and take very incidental facts about a pair of Game Boy games, and just try to make sure they look like they make as much sense as they reasonably can. But it's also worth noting that while Koga's Pokemon have the sort of on-model cuteness and even bubbly and even goofy vibe at times that we kind of expect from most Pokemon media, Agatha's Pokemon absolutely do not. These things are horrifying monsters, and I am here for it. Also, it's the moment you've been waiting for, since maybe even before this whole retrospective even started, because this is definitely something that I've been wanting to address. Koga's Arbok is just fine. That time they sliced that boy in half, don't worry, he grew back, he's fine, he's here, our boy has lived. So next time you see an article, a clickbaity article going, "Wowee, Pokemon Adventure sure is dark. I can't believe you sliced that Arbok in half." 1. I really don't think Pokemon Adventure is much darker than like a Naruto. In fact, if we take a step back, while most people are pretty fast to compare Pokemon Adventure to the anime, I think it would be a lot easier and a lot better of a comparison point to compare it to what anime in the same demographic would be going right about now, so things that would have been running in 1999 and 2000. And those series would be One Piece, Hunter x Hunter, Naruto, Shaman King. These are all series that would have been targeted at roughly the same age range as people that would be reading Pokemon Adventure, so I feel like that's probably a better comparison for the future and a better pedigree of things to keep in mind when you're talking about Pokemon Adventure. Ash Ketchum would probably not slice a Pokemon in twain, but you know who probably would? Sasuke, Killua. Just saying. Right, but tangents aside, my point being, Arbok is fine. And while we're at it, we go into Arbok's physiology for a moment, where on top of finding out they can grow back, the patterns on Arbok's belly also apparently gives it various flavors of power that Agatha uses to great effect. But through some teamwork and some blood, while Blue ends up blinded, Koga manages to send out his Ekans that is holding as in the keyword holding from Pokemon Gold and Silver, since we see a lot of references to Gold and Silver right about now, to heal up Blue, while also being able to trick Agatha and what seems to be killing her, because we just see her body just laying there, and we never hear from Agatha again, so the body count has gone up to at least 1. Meanwhile, Green and Sabrina find themselves frozen together and under attack by Lorelei, who has a hostage, and unlike Blue and Koga, they genuinely hate each other, and this is par for the course for Pokemon Adventure. The bad guys aren't aiming for a knockout, they're going for blood. But as Green does, she's been playing the long con, keeping both Lorelei and Sabrina fooled, where it turns out they were never attached to each other to begin with, and Green was actually using a Ditto to be a fake arm to give her a way out. Also, I should note that they can't break away from each other directly because Lorelei has magic ice powers, and that will somehow harm them. Like, it will rip their arms off because she has ice voodoo dolls. It's never really clearly explained if this is a thing Lorelei can do or is this a thing that Jinx is doing, but I like to believe a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. We also find a little bit more out about Green's motivation. What she's been trying to do was find out about the giant bird Pokemon that dragged her from her homeland into Kanto with nothing but a fear of birds. And she believes that the person who is controlling this giant bird Pokemon has to be someone on the Elite Four. And her goal is to take out the Elite Four, but obviously she can't do it alone, and it would be very helpful to have someone from Viridian Forest specifically, because being born in the forest gives you powers for reasons. You're gonna have to believe me on that. And the game plan was initially for Yellow to simply scout out the Elite Four and maybe get a gauge for how strong they are, but opportunities present itself, so they're in an outright brawl with them now. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Surge reveals that the rocket attack from earlier was actually an early stage of thwarting the Elite Four's plan. The duo of Surge and Bill end up walking onto a stone bridge above an acid lake, but it turns out the Elite Four seem to enjoy brawling above acid lakes because these two Onyx... This stone bridge is actually an Onyx that is not owned, but is friends with Bruno. I bring this up because it's always been kind of odd that Bruno has 2 Onyxes in the video games, and I guess the mangaka thought this was also odd too, so they had to figure out a reason for Bruno to be having 2 Onyxes on his team. Actually, I really like how they tie together elements of Pokemon that don't always quite make sense, like, hey, why does the Fighting type Master have non-Fighting type? And, well, we have our answer. And the same is true for Agatha, where most of her Pokemon are not Ghost. However, she does have to have a link to the power plant, adding more continuity to relatively incidental video game facts. But anyway, back to the fighting. So Yellow has this thing from the video game where you can see how Pikachu is. Pikachu must have known something about where the Elite Four base of operation is, and odds are, according to Blaine, Pikachu obviously can't talk or express much because it's been suffering from memory loss. Maybe it's the same way they were controlling Bruno, and by the way, they seem to be controlling Bruno, but maybe more likely just some traumatic stress Pika is suppressing. You know, sometimes the series makes me say sentences that I never would have thought I would have had to say otherwise. Surge and Bill are fighting Bruno, but are blocked off by some type of one-way mirror. It's probably worth noting that Bill, once again, is not a fighter, and the two are deep in over their heads. It took two to take down even one of the Elite Four, and Bruno is the one that likes to fight the most. Oh, poor Bill, he's just dragged along for the adventure on this arc. Surge is almost knocked into the acid below, but after an impressive mass self-destruct from many of his Pokemon, they are saved at the last second by Red, who's back to finish up his business with Bruno. There's a lot more happening here, but I kind of want you to read this, and I don't think it's super productive either of our time for me to take you through beat by beat of something that I want you to experience for yourself. Meanwhile, Yellow and Blaine are washed away as the other gym leaders catch on to the fact that the Elite Four are after the gym badges. Blaine and Yellow find themselves facing down Lance, and Blaine breaks out Mewtwo, who is now working on his side. However, much like an anime secret forbidden technique, he can only use Mewtwo for about 3 minutes at a time, lest he risks his own safety. Otherwise, Mewtwo will start to corrode outside of the special fluid that is inside of its Pokeball that keeps it alive, and by proxy, keeping Blaine alive as well. In the 2 years, the gross mess that was Mewtwo's cells that had been fused with Blaine's arm has gotten all the way up to his shoulder, so better to only use this technique for a few minutes at a time than risk your own safety. Yellow is generally a pacifist, so to make fighting easier, she goes for Lance, not for an attack, but to damage the capture mechanisms on his Pokeball, because even Mewtwo isn't a match for Lance, unfortunately. But when Mewtwo's time limit was just about up, to make matters worse, the Pokeballs that were damaged were actually already empty, with Lance's Dragon Pokemon down below causing tremors, and also the flood that would carry Blaine and Yellow up here. Knowing that Mewtwo would be injured if it fought any further, Yellow decides that it's actually time for her to fight, and gets her motley crew of Pokemon together for one of my favorite panels in the manga. Usually these Pokemon are horrible and disgusting. Like, have you ever seen a Graveler up close? Oh god. But here, they're as cute as a button. And this shows a little fact that I always have in the back of my head. Early Pokemon isn't afraid to stylize some of its characters. These guys actually have a lot in common with new Pokemon in the way that they're featured and somewhat simplified and stylized. They're much more rounder, much cuter, but still have the complex enough designs to keep my eyes engaged, unlike a lot of newer Pokemon that are streamlined but still cute. And I don't have that just don't have that Gen 1 slight overcomplication. This obviously is not an objective criticism, and probably one that should earn me a place in the retirement home, but I just had to mention I just love the organic feeling of old Pokemon. This part of the story actually swaps between the rest of our team quite a bit, but in short, Agatha seems to just be dead. Nice. Green stays one step ahead of Lorelei and Sabrina, and end up defeating Lorelei with some trickery, and Red and Bruno wrap up things, and Red uses his Eevee that can now evolve into different evolutions at the same time. Meanwhile, Yellow's bout with Lance is seeming pretty one-sided, with the exception of Pika, that isn't even Yellow's Pokemon. I also like the nerdy liberty the manga takes with specifying the level of each Pokemon as well, so that's nice. Yellow initially was planning on taking advantage of Lance's Pokemon being pretty tired and losing a battle of attrition. However, unfortunately for her, Lance also is from Viridian Forest and can heal his Pokemon as well, leaving them in a pretty bad situation. Lance pulls some ridiculous nonsense with Bubble Beam, refracting red, blue, and green waves of light, making the bubbles invisible, so Yellow is pelted with these bubble beams, except for the last possible second. Out of nowhere, our boy Giovanni shows up and realizes this Lance guy is a real bad dude, and it takes one bad guy to beat another bad guy, especially when they're using low-life tricks like this. And wouldn't you have it, Giovanni is from Viridian Forest too. His original Pokemon is in fact his Beedrill, which this is probably the only instance of Beedrill being cool, but I've also, at the time of recording, not read X and Y yet, so maybe Mega Beedrill shows up and Giovanni has another great moment, who knows. Now, I understand that the reason all these characters are working together is because they have a common enemy in the Elite Four, but the way Giovanni shows up on the scene is almost as if we were happy Giovanni was here, or look, Giovanni has changed his ways, which is absolutely not the case. We already know that Team Rocket is making their comeback. So this may be something that I want to say for the character section, but I don't know if I'm going to do a character section for this one, so we'll just talk about it here. In a lot of Pokemon media, and even the video games would do this, but years later, during Giovanni's initial appearance, he's treated as this cold, ruthless guy, but once he's off-screen, they tend to treat him as this figure to be venerated, or have a certain begrudging respect for. And perhaps it's the way nostalgia tends to materialize itself for villains. They try to also imply that Giovanni is somehow a morally complicated character, because he does mostly bad things, but also occasionally does something that isn't horrible or shows a certain element of humanity in him. And this implies that maybe his actions were bad, but he's a respectable character at this point, I suppose. And I think in this situation, there isn't a very tangible difference between hating Pokemon overtly and using them as tools, because the result is more or less the same. And while I really do that Giovanni is here to save the day, and I do like that they're trying to take his character in different directions, where Yellow now has to consider, are all Team Rocket characters inherently evil, or is there a notable difference between someone like Giovanni and Lance? The way this comes off, and the way that they try to imply that Giovanni isn't every bit the bastard he's always been, honestly falls flat on me. But anyway, Yellow has this very interesting moment, like I said before, of being conflicted on Lance being evil, but ultimately thinks he's doing a good thing, versus Giovanni, who's doing a good thing, but is very evil. Yellow also sees some level of parallel in herself and Giovanni, maybe in that they're both able to hear the hearts and minds of Pokemon, but this may just be a moment of moral weakness and knowing that, hey, if not for Giovanni, you would probably be dead by now, and a little bit of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Anyway, as cool as Giovanni... Anyway, if I had a nickel for every instance of Giovanni having a character at Beedrill point and saying, give up or you die, and as turns out this being an elaborate trap, I'd have 2 nickels. That isn't a lot, but it's weird that it's happened twice. Yes, as turns out, Giovanni was actually tricked to be in the center of the island right now, because as turns out, Ceres Island is a large badge amplifier, and the only badge they were missing was the Earth badge. So at that moment, Lance summons the spirit of a giant bird Pokemon that we'll definitely be talking about later. Most people know what this is already. Lance takes off and leaves Dragonite to stop Yellow. Lance's Dragonite, to Yellow's surprise, is actually down for this whole ending humanity situation that Lance seems to be into, and earnestly does believe that humans have no respect for the environment and how that affects Pokemon, and that this just built up into the rage leading to a human genocide that Dragonite now wants to enact. This is something Pokemon Black and White very lightly touches down on, but ultimately ends up toothless and hollow since most Pokemon are more or less down for the situation. But at this point in the series where we can openly ask the question of, does the haphazard treatment of the environment carry an extra layer of overt cruelty, because we are no longer talking about like dumb bugs, but things that are at least as smart as a toddler. That's an interesting place for Pokemon to go. And of course, it wouldn't be a manga dungeon without me making just a brief political digression. This is an interesting example of systemic changes that are made on an individual level, as the Elite Four all seem like, for the most part, normal people that just have strong feelings on nature and its relationship with Pokemon, and one day, well, I guess except for Bruno, decide to have a good old-fashioned genocide. And on that same note, Yellow once again posed to them, or to Dragonite in this case, that you always have the option to simply walk away. Yes, these things are bad. Yes, what you're doing is bad. But right now, in this moment, things are looking bad for you, Dragonite, and you have the option to just totally turn things around, and they opt not to. But unfortunately for Yellow, Lance follows the doctrine of might makes right, and Yellow simply does not have the might to match Lance, even if she did make strong endeavors. But at this very moment in time, Yellow decides to let go, and in some ways, embrace power, in many ways becoming like the person she dislikes, Giovanni, Team Rocket, and so on and so forth. Not in terms of being evil, but in terms of using every single tool at her disposal. So she finally lets Caterpie evolve into a Metapod, saving her. And stop me for seeing a theme here, but Dragonite's Hyper Beam, being stopped by an extra strong Metapod that evolves by the power of friendship, is really something special, and like a lot of Pokemon here, the only time Metapods really look cool. But just then, all of her Pokemon managed to evolve, even Golem, somehow, I guess. Maybe it's the same friendship logic that Blue's Machoke evolved in, growing as a person and all that good stuff. I'm not sure if it's fair to say that she in some way learned. I will accept that it may be somewhat of a stretch in that she learned from Giovanni in the brief time they spent together to use every single tool at her disposal, but it is an interesting parallel in that to reach her ambition, she's going to have to do things that she broadly doesn't want to do. And in terms of the journey as a whole, that this is fighting. In terms of the journey as a whole, Yellow tends to have issues around control, and having issues reconciling doing something she doesn't want to do. In this case, fighting, and in the case of her Pokemon, being able to let go and being able to let things change. You're never going to be able to have absolute control over the situation, and not trying to exercise the maximum amount of control and not being afraid to venture into the unknown is sometimes the thing you need to do, especially when saving your friends. When your back is up and against the wall and you have no other options, sometimes fortune favors the bold. Anyway, with this sudden rush of newfound power, partially from her own resolve, but admittedly mostly the energy from Viridian Forest being able to be channeled more effectively through Yellow, she's able to have one last supercharged Pokemon team square up against Lance. And maybe this is why Lance was so unbeatable, because he was also channeling energy from Viridian Forest. Anyway, it's never really explained. But on top of already being strong, anyway, Yellow and her Pokemon and the rest of the gang's Pokemon all give out one last blast in hopes to disrupt the Badge Amplifier, leading to Pikachu using Mega Volt to defeat Lance. I'm going to give you a little context, so that's fun. So Thunderbolt in Japanese is called 100,000 volts, and in English this one is 1,000,000 volts, or Mega. So the term million for megavolt, while sounding a little generic, it's actually pretty spot on. Anyway, all the Pokemon that were attacking the various cities go back to normal. Some Deus Ex Machina stuff goes on because when Yellow went plus Ultra and the power of the forest just went into her, I guess. The giant bird Pokemon turns all that destructive energy Lance was channeling and puts it into warm, healing life energy. Yellow passes out after the battle, but is woken up by Red in Viridian Forest, with her and her Pokemon chilling out one last time before she knows she has to say goodbye to Pikachu. However, this is all just a dream. But don't worry, they are still hanging out, though. They did win. Leading us to the ending, where everyone ends up going their separate ways once again, and Pika returning to Red. The bird Pokemon has flown off west towards something. And speaking of westward, Green also has something in mind for the next arc, wrapping up with a big 2-page promotional spread for Pokemon the Gold and Silver arc, or Gen 2 as we know it. And scene. Whew, okay, so where do we start? So this is the first shot at the Pokemon Adventure series doing an entirely original story. So how did Kusaka do? Well, frankly, I think he hit it out of the park, and in many ways he hit it so out of the park that Pokemon would spend the better part of the next 2 decades looking for the ball. In many ways, this arc and certain elements of the previous arc would end up eating Pokemon Gold and Silver's lunch on low-hanging fruit for a Pokemon sequel. For example, a plucky new hero that in some ways represents the future, who doesn't have the gumption of Red or the brains of Green or the skills of Blue, but they end up embarking on a new adventure helped by old friends and characters that have learned their lesson and changed along the way. This seems like a pretty easy passing the torch story of Kanto having a new champion while reminding us that our old pals are still here and still doing their best, even if we still have some new faces that have taken up the mantle. And we did just that. How about a team where, I don't know, maybe Team Rocket manipulating Pokemon evolution and ultimately trying to use it for nefarious purposes? Oh, we did that too. Oh, okay, well how about borrowing our heroes from communication over phone lines and internet and radio, because doing that would leave them vulnerable to the bad guys finding them. And we have several different characters finding their own path, leading to one climactic showdown. Okay, we did that too. Okay, well how about the more obvious route of visiting a Kanto that has been left behind by Red and exploring how our old heroes and villains have changed and grown over the last several years, and seeing how Kanto has healed, and mostly while also unraveling the secrets behind a absent Red and trying to find a way to introduce him into the climax of the story at the top of maybe a mountain. And also explain why Pikachu is the headliner Pokemon instead of Poliwhirl or Venusaur. Dang, well, we did all that too. Yeah, we really have our bases covered for what a Pokemon sequel would be, without even necessarily having the motivation to make a proper sequel. For those not in the know, Kusaka generally does have some limited knowledge of Pokemon games before they come out, but I don't think this was necessarily the case for Gold and Silver, or at the very least Kusaka only had knowledge of what was understood of what would become Pokemon Gold and Silver in 1998, with the actual knowledge of the games themselves coming out when, well, the games would come out, which would have been the last third of this series. Part of me also wonders, is this just a natural thing to do with a plot like Pokemon? It seems so interesting that they would use a lot of very obvious low-hanging fruit ideas for a Pokemon sequel on an in-between arc. But I also wonder, is this just a natural place to go with a Pokemon story? When you have a world of animals that are made to fight and a world that is also rapidly evolving in terms of technology, I suppose a story about environmental justice is just a natural place to go with it. And if your heroes are primarily using Pokemon to fight, I guess it does stand to reason to earnestly ask the question, are we the baddies? Or at the very least introduce a character that, in all earnestly, believes you to be the baddies. But even with that information in mind, can we truly say that the Elite Four are wrong for what they believe in? Well, yes. Yes, we can, because it's a pretty easy slam dunk. Morally, genocide is always bad. However, can we at least say that the Elite Four had a very good point? In fact, I would argue their point is so good that we would later have another Pokemon villain that seems to have very similar motivations, and understanding that the way we treat the environment is simply not acceptable, and they know that beyond a reasonable doubt, given 1 year, 10 years, 1,000 years, no matter how long you give people to get better, they just will simply not do it because it's not convenient. So the only way to move forward from here is to compel that movement by force. Actually, while we're on the subject, let's slowly begin wrapping this one up and actually talk about the Elite Four. Like I said before, a lot of the stuff that we talk about today is going to tie into the Gold and Silver arc, so I don't see a huge reason to have a big wrap-up for characters that aren't new. So today, we're just going to do the Elite Four, and I guess we already did Yellow, but you know what I mean. Right, so the Japanese name for the Elite Four is the Shitenno, or the Four Heavenly Kings. That's a little bit of a mouthful, especially in a world as grounded as Pokemon, and maybe even a little bit opulent sounding. But this is actually a really common trope in Asian media, not just in terms of having four super strong guys, but more in literal terms. It comes from the four Buddhist gods that watch over the cardinal directions. However, in Japanese, these were first bestowed upon the four retainers of Miyamoto no Morimitsu, for just being such big lads and big chads. Tons of media have their own shitano that have been translated in many different ways. For example, the four fiends of Final Fantasy, those are shitano. The Elite Four of Kill la Kill, also shitano. The Nega Commanders of Sailor Moon, shitano. And in Toei's adaptation of Yu-Gi-Oh!, Kaiba had his own shitano as filler villains. And on top of things that literally have the title Shitano, there are also a billion other very similar concepts of four beings that just stand head and shoulders above the rest. Okay, so now you see why I thought it may have been a little odd to switch that Elite Four moniker they have up to Elite 5, because it really messes up the whole motif they have going. Because hey, this term exists as a part of Japanese culture, so it seems a little harder culturally to decouple the number 4 from the title itself, whereas in English, Elite Four, it's just the title for these 4 particular strong trainers. And I guess I'll end this small tangent about the terminology of Elite Four with my favorite localization for Shitano has gotta be the Spice Boys. Please post your own favorite version of Shitano in the comments. Thank you. Okay, right, tangent over. So first up of the Elite Four is Lorelei. So as a youth, her seal was poisoned by the pollution, but Agatha used her ghastly to absorb the poison, and from there that really enabled her hatred for humanity's cruelty, while also enabling a certain adoration and respect for Agatha, almost like a grandmother or auntie-like figure. Lorelei also seemed to have psychic powers, and that's a cool pun, not intended, but I'll take credit for it. I actually don't really have much else to say besides her, outside of I love the contrived reasons to get the protagonist into bad situations, like how we saw earlier with the very fierce pursuing with the with the spike cannons powered up by aurora beams, or Lorelei having all sorts of weird cursed ice powers that put our protagonist into way more danger, some of which actually does end up lasting well past this arc. Again, some of the stuff around Lorelei seems a little bit contrived around her powers, but I always maintain that being contrived is a great reason to get our protagonist into a bad situation, but never a good reason to get them out of it. This also sets a good precedent for giving our protagonist other threats to deal with besides other Pokemon. And sometimes it seems a little unclear if it's Jinx with the cursed magic powers or Lorelei, but hey, it's fine. Lorelei is a character that actually doesn't really have a whole lot of lore in-game, or nothing that you can very clearly tie her to, so just being tied to Agatha is the best we're gonna do for a character that really doesn't have a whole lot going on. Next up is Agatha. So I really, once again, appreciate that Agatha and Lorelei both have supernatural powers that are done maybe on their own, maybe via Pokemon. It's not always clear, although for Agatha it does lean a little bit more towards Pokemon. And once again, has a Dream Eater that locks Blue in some sort of eternal dream hellscape, and they are the 2 closest members of the Elite Four. So that is interesting to see, especially because as the arc goes on, it's sort of difficult to tell what the Elite Four's relationship is with each other, especially since once Lance shows up, all eyes are more or less on him for the remainder of the plot, so we don't really see too much of what these characters interact with, outside of knowing that Bruno is not entirely willing to go with the plan. Anyway, we also know the Pokemon Deep lore of Professor Oak at some point in the past had a thing with Agatha in the games. This seemed to be a little bit more romantic in nature, maybe one part romantic, maybe one part rivals, a little column A, a little column B. In the manga, Professor Oak seems to be the normal type master, contrasting Agatha's ghost types, and that's an interesting note for how this situation will just simply not work out. In the manga, Agatha and Oak were part of a research group. Oak left in order to pursue completion of the Pokedex, and I don't believe it's ever really been noted why Professor Oak is so passionate about completion of the Pokedex specifically, but I can just attribute that to the quirky old man thing that Professor Oak tends to have throughout the various adaptations of Pokemon. But he is. Agatha writes off documenting every single Pokemon as a fool's errand, and they end up fighting. Agatha lost and swore a grudge against Oak and all of his associates. It's inferred that unlike Lorelie, Agatha always had a foul attitude and just happened to be passionate about Pokemon, and happened to just be comfortable with the macabre, and her already existing bitter nature just lent itself to this particular cause. I also like that her Pokemon generally don't have pupils. They managed to make her Arbok look more threatening than just being a big goofy snake. This is, again, the last we're going to really be seeing of Agatha, so I hope you enjoyed that. Goodbye, Agatha. Best wishes in the hereafter. Bruno is the simplest of the Elite Four. He's simply a proud warrior guy who finds nobility in battling and being able to live alongside with Pokemon, and actually finds a lot of commonality with Red. I don't believe they make it entirely clear how he gets wrapped up in the Elite Four. Normally, I would assume it's roughly the same way that Red got wrapped up with them in having an invitation that I guess maybe Bruno either accepted or was mind controlled into doing, which, by the way, that's what his big wristbands are here. Those are tools for mind control. But I can't help but wonder, as I previously said, Shi to know, or Four Heavenly Kings, does have a very particular numerical meaning there, so I kind of wonder what was the process of getting exactly 4 people together. I'm sure in lore this could be relatively easily explained away as once they got about 4 people, they figured it was a good idea to give themselves the title, or maybe people noticed that there were just 4 incredibly powerful eco-terrorists roaming around and just thought 4 Heavenly Kings was just the most appropriate title for them. But regardless of that, unlike the other Elite Four members that do some amount of lip service to doing the right thing for Pokemon, but eventually get lost in the weeds of focusing on mass genocide, that seems to maybe or maybe not being in the broader service of Pokemon, Bruno is the one that still remembers to actually be kind to Pokemon, and he's the one that finds the most natural commonality with the values of our heroes. Given that Bruno is the only one of the Elite Four members to return in Generation 2, as still an Elite Four member, I wonder how far ahead did Kusaka know when writing the script for Generation 2. This is the fun thing about manga. I can never quite tell what's a friendly coincidence, or what was just a naturally occurring inkling of a plot thread that Kusaka could simply sink his teeth into. Also, again, I like that Bruno has Onyxes, not because they just ran out of fighting types, but because he just loves picking duels and over giant deadly acid pits. And then finally there's Lance. I actually don't really know what to really say about Lance. You know in Dragon Ball how they have Jiren, who isn't an especially evil or especially horrible guy, he's just really buff and really strong? That's how Lance strikes me. I mean, he is bad, but he just seems to be a character who in many ways is an obstacle for our heroes to overcome. He's just a person with a really, really high power level, which is fun. That's a lot of fun. And I think in most shonen series, I would actually really, really hate that. But given how grounded Pokemon is as a series, where even if there are turtles that can shoot water, or monsters that can throw a million punches a second, when it comes to everything else, we're basically playing by the real world rules. Even with something as fantastical as Pokemon, they do have their own innate limitations, and that's why it's so shocking that Lance shows up and does a big giant Dragon Ball Z Hyper Beam. In many ways, maybe this arc, and the Elite Four in particular, is sort of the turning point in, I don't want to call it power scaling, but I guess it is power scaling to some degree, but I don't necessarily mean it in a positive or negative way, where usually Pokemon are, and generally will continue to be, maybe at most as threatening as maybe a bear, or a bear that has a gun. But with the exception of Bruno, this is about the time where we start to see Pokemon really having, honest to God, supernatural powers. From being able to manipulate people's dreams and lock them in ghostly prisons, or using cursed ice magic, or even invoking more holy properties that Dragon-type Pokemon seem to have. Like, sure, a Pokemon like Snorlax seems pretty strong, but can it control a storm? Well, Dragonair can do that. And we're really only going to see spectacle like this increase, which, for me, I think that's a good thing. Most people would characterize power scaling as a negative, but I think for Pokemon specifically, this kind of thing has a certain level of, I would say, novelty. Anyway, this slowly gets retconned later on, but I also just want to highlight that while this stops being true when Mato stops being the main artist, I like that Lance is short. That I find very amusing. And again, it very much reminds me of Vegeta of Dragon Ball Z, where during his initial introduction of showing up and blowing up a bunch of stuff on a scale we've never seen before, he's also a short king. So, hats off to you. What I find a little bit more interesting about Lance is maybe Lance's Dragonite, specifically the fact that his Dragonite is down for the cause of ending all humanity and is also an eco-terrorist. We usually find that Pokemon themselves aren't bad, but they just do bad things because they're commanded to. And this idea normally comes from the anime, and this more or less seems to be, for the most part, consistent with most forms of Pokemon media. Like, on very rare occasion will we really get a scumbag Pokemon. So it was interesting seeing Dragonite, who I would expect to be a Pokemon that is loyal to Lance more so than the mission, be honest to God, ready to fight and die for this cause. While I've been characterizing the Elite Four as more of an eco-terrorist cell, more akin to, say, Avalanche from Final Fantasy VII, I get the feeling that what seems to be a little bit more accurate is almost being more of a death cult in nature, except for the fact that the cult can only have 4 people. Partially because Lorelei was inducted into it at such a young age, and had her hatred and anger fostered over time, and Bruno seemed to have been partially conscripted, not entirely of his own will, but, not entirely on his own either. And cults do have a certain tendency to take in people that are somewhat sympathetic to their causes and not necessarily down for everything, but using other flavors of coercive means to make sure that people within them stay within them. Now, normally that's more social pressure or sometimes implicit force, but here we have straight direct mind control. So, there we are. Most of these characters will appear in the next part of Pokemon Adventure, so I don't have too much to say about them, but that's for the most part all I had to say about them for now. Okay, so let's talk about the more thematic stuff. So, the manga never really gestures too much at the Elite Four being entirely wrong, but in classic Pokemon style puts a conflict in front of you and lets you make your own speculation about what the nuances here are. Specifically that the Elite Four aren't just wrong because they're bad guys and bad guys are wrong, because at no point does the series really offer any resistance, implying that what the Elite Four are saying is wrong, or implies that they're wrong for being so angry. And it's certainly not saying that humanity as a whole doesn't deserve the impending hellscape that's about to befall them. Not saying that it's pro-mass genocide or anything like that, but it just isn't really bothering to condemn them either. The series more so just gestures at what the correct opinion is, and just by looking at what happened, sure, the power plants are toxic and have killed several Pokemon and tons of people are mean to Pokemon, and hey, we can point to people like Red, Blue, Yellow, and Green as more or less good people, but look at them, they're working literally hand in hand with Team Rocket. However, if you ignore the circumstantial stuff around that, the good Kanto gym leaders on the other hand are living proof that Pokemon and humans can more or less work together just fine. And while Blue and Green may have their issues that they have to unlearn, or just find the right type of Pokemon that are more or less willing to go with their sort of antics, Red and Yellow represent the pinnacle of being pretty good about this. Red is willing to concede that not all Pokemon really want to fight or should honestly have to. Yellow is the opposite in that she doesn't really want to fight, period, even in the most civil and safe circumstances, and is more interested in Pokemon just kind of doing their thing, even when her own Pokemon were ready to brawl. Last time we discussed that technology is sort of a neutral asset, capable of making life great with advents like Pokeballs or electricity, the internet, and so on and so forth. But this time the conversation is a little less nuanced, but technology is just a good idea that is vulnerable to human folly. And corruption, like poisoning the water, emitting toxic gas, or Pokeballs, with humans who have gone too far of labeling themselves as masters, or seeing Pokemon as inherently inferior, or abusing the dynamic between Pokemon and trainer, etc., it becomes way more notable that while the Elite Four's intentions, I'm sure were good at some point, they were just totally wrecked by the exact same human folly that they seem to dislike. Letting the anger related to environmental justice totally fog up the mission of what that is, and ultimately in some way, perpetuating the exact same system of Pokemon abuse that they seek to end. For example, the whole mass controlling of Pokemon armies to wreak havoc across Kanto, the whole wiping out humanity thing. That almost certainly have an effect on the Pokemon ecology. I'm pretty sure that much like animals in real life that have carved out a certain ecological niche that is based around people being there, I have to assume that a lot of the same is more or less true of Pokemon, like Meowth needing to have a coin on his head, or Ghastly on Haunter feeding off chemical runoff, semi-feral Pokemon like Pikachu and Rattata finding feeding patterns based on human-built civilization, and in the most extreme examples, Pokemon like Grimer, Coughing, and Porygon, and even the mighty Mewtwo itself, all seem to require the existence of humanity to continue to exist. The Elite Four all have some particular flavor of human folly corrupting their more or less good intentions. Agatha's folly of being bitter and feeling betrayed and projecting that onto their goals, Lorelei being angry that someone would hurt Pokemon and is more concerned with punishing them than doing right by them. Agatha just being an overall very bitter person, by the way. However, the one that really seems to get it is probably Bruno, who seems pretty good about who is big on finding a certain balance between the honorable life of a warrior and building a world for both humans and Pokemon to be built to live side by side with each other and not necessarily in a master-slave relationship. But also he's being mind-controlled, and the part about the warrior, the one that seems to be the best about this is probably Bruno, who does find a certain balance in the life of a noble warrior, building a world for both human and Pokemon. But he's mind-controlled, so we can't really trust his opinion all that much. But also, the idea of domination with Bruno. Didn't like the tone of my voice in that one. Leaving him to do his own thing. Maybe he wouldn't necessarily release the nukes like Lance wants to, but we also have to make note that being a proud warrior guy makes him feel very comfortable picking a fight with people like Bill, who aren't really much of fighters. I can't really say much for Bruno at this point when he's under no mind control influence whatsoever, but I can definitely see Bruno being down with a certain level of might makes right social Darwinism, basically, where he may find something like a Safari Zone, where Pokemon more or less live to their own devices, or even a place like a Pokemon Zoo that we know exists in Pokemon canon as something disgusting, because Pokemon should be out there thrashing about, eating each other, and doing whatever Pokemon do, left to their own devices, regardless of if some of that stuff can probably be helped by humanity, like maybe not having them in a position where they have to eat each other, but who knows. I'm definitely just projecting some of that corruption of going with the natural way onto Bruno, so who knows. Okay, so this one's getting pretty long, so let's wrap this up. So this was a very different direction to go for a Pokemon sequel, ironically one that the series of games would actually take a long time to catch up with. except for the concept of no longer following the adventures of Red specifically, but a new protagonist, and it would also be an interesting way. Also, it would have a lot of interesting ways to incorporate ideas that would be in the Gold and Silver games to explore, specifically looking at the world and impact that Red would end up leaving behind for the most part, although they do end up going in very different directions with this. This is probably because the plot of Gold and Silver changed a few times, but after the manga's plot was more or less already decided on, and I really appreciate the level of dense Pokemon continuity in this arc. We don't even have a proper Pokemon sequel yet, but we can already see that there is very clearly a proud legacy that they intend to keep going with. While maybe it's not entirely clear that at this point in the franchise's history, they would be aware that Pokemon would be a long-term juggernaut, and to my understanding, Nintendo would be under the impression that Pokemon 2 would be the last Pokemon games. It's very clear that the manga, at least at this point, is in it for the long haul, and already understands that it has a proud legacy that it really wants to live up to, be that on Nintendo's terms or telling its own stories. And also, for those of you who like to go outside, this arc is actually a great conversation starter because most Pokemon fans generally stop at the end of the Red, Blue, and Green arc, blissfully unaware that Koga's Arbok is perfectly fine, and there is sort of a reason as to why Pikachu sort of becomes Red's headliner Pokemon. And the one I find the most interesting, what does Lance of the Elite Four have in common, and not in common, with Barrett of Final Fantasy VII? Okay, well finally, did you know this channel was initially going to be a ripoff of Ross's Game Dungeon? Up to and including awarding merit badges. I moved away from the idea, but given the fact that I guess I've taken it upon myself to talk about Pokemon now, I think badges are pretty appropriate, wouldn't you say? So Yellow, here are your badges. I award you the Ahead of Your Time badge, a group of terrorists that take action based on asking the question of, is humanity's relationship with Pokemon entirely ethical? That's a question that every single bad faith article has asked, that really had an edgy answer, but Pokemon Yellow had a very earnest one. 2. Environmental storytelling. I've always felt that older millennials, including myself, may have coped with Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow being a Game Boy game with very little plot for Generation 1 by saying that it quietly placed you into a world, but let you draw your own conclusions about the nature of said world. But it also plays you into not really wanting to draw that many conclusions because your place in this world is that of a child, with no other context or anything else to really have your opinions bounce off of. But here in the manga, it's very plainly stated within the text. There are some people that are basically okay with the way things are, and a lot of Pokemon who are more or less okay with the status quo too. But a lot of questions get raised when we introduce the idea of not everyone in this world is a good faith actor, and those bad faith actors are more or less comfortable with taking their beliefs to their logical extreme in an otherwise cartoon world. And finally for today, you're getting the Ambition badge. Now they could have very easily said, the setup for Pokemon Yellow is going to be, the Elite Four are having a big tournament at Pokemon Stadium, and Red and friends are invited. They could have simply taken material from the anime even if they wanted to, or just made up other stuff for Red to be doing. But no, they chose to tell a passing the torch story, even before knowing that Pokemon as a series would even have a torch that needed to be passed. And they asked questions that only a madman that wants to lose Nintendo money would earnestly ask with a straight face and actually give a couple of answers to. Speaking of madmen that would ask questions that Nintendo really does not want you asking, I didn't really talk about Lugia making an appearance, and that's because there's a lot to unpack about Lugia itself and its designer, Takeshi Shido, our good old boy that I was also wrong about in part 1, by the way. There's a lot to say about the band that probably has been pretty well documented on the internet, but no one has read this book, and I made an audio book of it for you to listen to, but no one has done that either, so I guess we're gonna have to do another video with Takeshi Shido and also the Pokemon books that he's written. But my point is, we'll talk about Lugia making an early bird cameo a different day. So, as Pokemon Adventures is looking forward to Generation 2, I actually have a lot of unfinished business in Kanto. That said, I guess this is going to be the informal announcement that I guess I've decided to become the Pokemon manga and book guy, because Pokemon fans hate reading. Except for that one guy on YouTube whose videos I don't watch because I don't want to accidentally steal one of his opinions. Unlike me, actually good at making videos, you know the guy. So sorry, giant Yu Yu Hakusho or Yu-Gi-Oh! Retrospective I had planned to happen for all of 2023. I gotta tell people about whatever this is. Okay, thank you all so much for watching. I couldn't do it without you. Have a good, I'm gonna place my bets. Playing Scarlet and Violet, maybe. I'm sure saying that won't make me look like I missed a bunch of deadlines. Okay, have a good night.